It began not with mercy, but with fire. Across the endless plains of Asia, where the wind howled like the cries of ghosts, the Mongol horsemen moved as if born from the storm itself. Villages vanished in smoke before dawn, and entire kingdoms fell before their hooves, before the sun could rise twice. Yet what the world feared most about the Mongols was not only their skill in war, it was what came after victory. In the early 13th century, under the banner of Temujin, who the world would come to know as Genghis Khan, the Mongols became a force that defied comprehension. They were not a people seeking borders. They were seekers of dominion. Their empire stretched from the frozen forests of the north to the burning deserts of the south, swallowing nations older than memory. And in their path, those who resisted met not only death but a fate far worse for those left behind. When a Mongol army approached, its shadow arrived long before the men. Scouts spread terror by stories alone of cities turned to dust, of princes boiled alive, and of women whose beauty became both a blessing and a curse. The Mongols believed in total war. To them, defeat was not simply a loss of territory, it was the destruction of a people's identity, pride, and bloodline. The chronicles of Persian, Chinese, and Russian historians all tell of what came after the Mongols won a city. The gates would fall, and the slaughter would begin, not as madness, but as ritual. Men who had fought were executed. Sometimes, entire male populations were exterminated to prevent rebellion. And then came the fate of the women's wives, daughters, and widows of the defeated. Their lives were decided in the aftermath of conquest. To understand what the Mongols did to the wives of their enemies, one must first understand their view of power. To them, women were both trophies and tools of assimilation. In Mongol tradition, women within their own tribe were respected. Some even held influence in political and domestic matters. But the wives of their enemies were not afforded the same consideration. They symbolized the humiliation of those who had dared to resist the Great Khan. When Samarkand fell, when Nishapur was burned to the ground, and when Kiev was taken after months of siege, similar scenes repeated themselves. The Mongols would gather the survivors, those too weak or too terrified to fight, and divide them like spoils. The artisans were spared to serve the empire. The young and strong were taken as slaves. And among them, the women were chosen by the warriors, often in silence, as the smoke of their homes rose behind them. Persian historian, who lived during the Mongol invasions, wrote of how the wives of defeated nobles were brought before Mongol generals. Some were taken as concubines. Others were given as rewards to soldiers. The Mongols saw this as justice, a reversal of fortune, in which the conqueror claimed what once belonged to the vanquished. It was a cruel law of conquest, justified by the belief that resistance deserved annihilation. There are accounts, too, of what happened in the city of Nishapur in 1221, when a Mongol general was killed during the siege. His death enraged Genghis Khan's daughter, who demanded vengeance. The Mongols slaughtered the population, men, women, and children alike. The wives of nobles were taken alive, and some were forced to serve as slaves in Mongol camps, living reminders of a vengeance that would never fade. In their eyes, the act was not savagery but order. The Mongols did not see themselves as cruel, they saw themselves as instruments of destiny. They believed that those who opposed the will of the Khan were not simply enemies. They were rebels against the eternal sky itself. Thus, whatever was done to their families was not seen as immoral. It was divine punishment. The stories spread faster than the armies themselves. In the markets of Bukhara, travelers whispered of what had happened to the wives of the Khwarezmian nobles after their empire fell. Some were taken as concubines by Mongol commanders. Others were forced into marriage with low-ranking soldiers, a deliberate humiliation meant to erase noble bloodlines. Entire dynasties were broken, not only by the sword but by the mingling of blood and the destruction of lineage. One chronicler described how the women of conquered lands were paraded before Mongol officers like cattle. The youngest and most beautiful were chosen first. Some were sold to merchants following the army, sent eastward to be traded in the markets of Karakoram or Sam. Others were kept as spoils for the soldiers who had shed the most blood. The Mongols had a system for everything. Even for this, after victory, a census of survivors was often taken. Men capable of bearing arms were executed, while women were divided among the ranks, according to merit. It was said that the Khan himself could claim any woman he desired from the conquered lands. The wives of kings, sultans, and generals became symbols of Mongol supremacy, forced to bear children who would one day serve the empire that had destroyed their fathers. Thrones yet not all were doomed to misery. Some, through cunning or circumstance, rose within Mongol society. Genghis Khan himself took women from conquered tribes and treated some of them with honor, elevating their sons to positions of power. But for most, the story ended in silence. Their names vanished, their lives recorded only as numbers in chronicles that spoke more of victories than of human suffering. There are whispers of one woman, the wife of a Khwarezmian prince, who is said to have taken her own life rather than be taken by the Mongols. Another tale tells of a noblewoman who poisoned a Mongol officer in his sleep, only to be flayed alive when discovered. Such stories were rare but spread widely. for they offered a flicker of defiance in a world ruled by fear. Asterisk, the Mongol conquests were not random acts of cruelty, they were calculated demonstrations of terror. By destroying the wives and families of their enemies, the Mongols ensured that rebellion would never rise again. A kingdom without heirs, without pride, without women to remember its dead, was a kingdom erased from history. Asterisk, even in the later years, when the Mongols ruled over Persia, China, and parts of Russia, their policy remained the same. Mercy was a privilege earned only through surrender. Resistance meant extinction, and the wives of the defeated bore the heaviest burden, their fates woven into the empire's relentless expansion. Asterisk to the Mongols. Domination was not complete until the blood of the conquered mingled with their own. They sought not only submission but transformation, turning the wives of their enemies into vessels through which the empire would perpetuate itself. In this way, the Mongol Empire did not merely destroy nations, it absorbed them, piece by piece, through fear, violence, and blood. Asterisk, and so, when the fires of conquest burned brightest, when the steppe wind carried the scent of death across the ruins of cities, the last sound one might hear was not the clash of swords but the cries of those who had lost everything. The wives of the defeated were not killed outright. They were made to live, and in living, they bore witness to the power of the empire that had shattered their world. Asterisk for the Mongols. This was the price of defiance. For history, it was a reminder of what happens when victory becomes more than conquest, when it becomes the erasure of the human soul itself. When the fires of conquest dimmed and the hooves of Mongol horses faded beyond the horizon, the lands they left behind were not merely conquered, they were transformed. The destruction of armies and cities was visible, but the deeper wound lay in the quiet ruins, where women, children, and survivors faced a future that no longer belonged to them. Asterisk, in every territory the Mongols subdued, from the cities of Persia to the valleys of Rus, a pattern emerged that history still shudders to recall. The warriors rode on. The Khan's banners moved further west, but behind them, the fabric of ancient societies unraveled. The wives and daughters of the defeated became the living reminders of a world erased. Asterisk, Persian chroniclers wrote that after Genghis Khan's armies moved through, there was no sound of life left in entire provinces. The women who once lived in palaces and wore silk veils now walked barefoot among the ashes of their homes. Some were carried away to distant lands, their names lost to the steppes. Others remained, forced to live under Mongol rule, as part of a new order that neither honored their lineage nor allowed them to forget it. Asterisk, the Mongols practiced what modern historians might call psychological conquest. Their treatment of the wives of defeated enemies was designed to send a message. It told the living, resistance will destroy not only your body, but your memory. A husband might die a warrior's death, but his wife would live to see his enemies claim everything he had defended. Asterisk, in the great cities of the Islamic world, where poetry once flourished, silence settled after the Mongols passed. Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, would later fall in 1258 to Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson. When the city was taken, thousands were executed. The caliph's family and court were put to death, and the women of the palace, wives, concubines, and attendants were taken away. The chronicles describe it not as chaos, but as a systematic dismantling of an empire's dignity. The Mongols made sure that the wives of rulers and ministers did not remain symbols of old authority. By claiming or enslaving them, they erased the very concept of royal blood. Asterisk, across Europe. As the Mongol advance reached the edges of Poland and Hungary, rumors spread faster than the armies themselves. Refugees told stories of what had happened to the families of princes and generals in the east. Many of these tales were exaggerated by fear, but their essence was truth. The Mongols had turned conquest into a total act of domination. When a nobleman resisted, he lost not only his throne but his family's honor. Asterisk, in Rus. After the fall of Ryazan and Vladimir, entire generations were wiped out. The chronicles of the time describe how the Mongols treated the women of noble houses as spoils of war, not for pleasure, but as proof that resistance was futile. Some were forced into service as attendants to Mongol officers. Others were relocated, taken across the steppes where their names and origins disappeared. Asterisk, there were exceptions, rare but notable. Occasionally, a woman of remarkable intelligence or beauty could influence her captors. History records that Mongol leaders, including Genghis Khan himself, sometimes took women from conquered tribes as wives or secondary consorts, giving them real authority within their households. The Mongol Empire, despite its cruelty, respected strength, yet this respect did not lessen the suffering of the thousands of women who were taken against their will, stripped of identity, and absorbed into a vast empire that called itself chosen by the eternal blue sky. Asterisk, the fates of these women had political consequences. Through them, the Mongols merged bloodlines, intentionally or not. Their children carried the mixed heritage of conqueror and conquered. Over time, this blending changed the face of the empire. In Persia, for example, Mongol rulers began adopting local customs, religions, and languages. The Ilkhanate, founded by saw its leaders eventually convert to Islam, transformation influenced in part, by their wives and mothers who came from the conquered peoples. This was the paradox of Mongol rule. The same brutality that erased nations also created a strange new unity through assimilation. The wives of defeated rulers, once symbols of loss, became bridges between worlds. Yet, for most, that bridge was built on tragedy. One of the most haunting accounts comes from a Chinese chronicle describing the fall of Jiangdu, modern-day Beijing. In 1215, the Jin dynasty capital resisted for months before surrendering. When the city finally fell, its citizens expected mercy. Instead, the Mongols unleashed days of destruction. Many women of noble families were seized and distributed among the Mongol ranks. The chroniclers wrote that the once great city became a field of ghosts. For years after, the survivors spoke of it in whispers, as though even the memory of that time carried a curse. What makes these stories even more chilling is how the Mongols justified them. To the warriors of the steppe, loyalty was sacred, but mercy was weakness. The wives of defeated men were considered part of the spoils ordained by heaven's will. The great Khan himself believed that the sky favored his conquests, and that resistance was a rebellion not against man, but against destiny. By this reasoning, the suffering of women and families was not cruelty, it was cosmic justice. Historians today struggle to quantify the scale of human loss during those decades. The Mongol campaigns in Central Asia alone killed millions, but numbers cannot capture what was lost in spirit and memory. For every city that burned, there were countless women whose stories were never written, their voices erased. We know them only through fragments, references in chronicles, poems written in grief, or legends that survived in the songs of refugees. In the centuries that followed, travelers who crossed the former Mongol territories noticed something striking. The descendants of the conquered peoples often bore mixed features, their languages laced with Mongol words. Even as the empire declined, the legacy of those forced unions remained etched in the bloodlines of Asia and Eastern Europe. The wives of defeated enemies had been turned into the silent architects of a new, unintended world, one born from conquest, fear, and survival. But history has a cruel balance. The same empire that imposed such terror would one day face its own disintegration, torn by internal divisions and the very diversity it had created. When Mongol Khanate fought among themselves, the pattern repeated. Cities burned, families were destroyed, and women once again paid the price of men's wars. The wheel of violence turned endlessly, consuming conqueror and conquered alike. By the late 14th century, the Mongol Empire was no longer a unified force. Its descendants ruled fragmented khanates from China to the Black Sea. The grandsons of Genghis Khan spoke many tongues and followed many gods. Yet wherever they went, the memory of their ancestors' conquests remained a warning written in ash and silence. In the oral traditions of Central Asia, there are still stories told by nomads about the fall of great cities, about women who vanished into the steppe, and about the endless wind that carries their names. These are not tales of glory, but of sorrow. They remind listeners that empire always demands a price, and that the suffering of the defeated never truly fades. From a historical standpoint, what the Mongols did to the wives of their enemies reflected a brutal logic: to destroy an enemy's future, one must destroy his family's dignity. It was an act of domination that transcended physical conquest. It reached into the soul of a people and broke it. Yet ironically, in breaking others, the Mongols planted the seeds of their own transformation. By the time of Kublai Khan, the empire had absorbed so many cultures that the conquerors themselves were no longer purely Mongol. Their rulers married women from China, Korea, Persia, and beyond. The Mongol identity, once fierce and unyielding, became a mosaic of influences. The wives who had once been trophies became mothers of new dynasties, educators of princes, and, in subtle ways, preservers of their original cultures. In the ruins left behind, temples were rebuilt, cities were reborn, and the descendants of the conquered slowly rose again. The memory of what had been done to them, however, did not die. It passed through generations as a silent scare lesson about the fragility of power and the enduring strength of those who survive it. Even today, historians debate the legacy of the Mongols. Some see them as destroyers, others as unifiers, who connected the East and West through trade and culture. But no amount of progress can erase the human cost of their rise. For behind every triumph recorded in their chronicles lies an unwritten history of grief, the wives who lost everything, whose suffering shaped the destiny of nations. The Mongols changed the world. They redrew maps, rewrote laws, and redefined warfare. Yet their empire was built not only on courage and strategy, but on fear, subjugation, and silence. The treatment of the wives of defeated enemies stands as one of its darkest legacies, a reminder that even the greatest conquerors leave behind shadows that history cannot forget. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell, the steppe wind still whispered through the grasslands of Mongolia. Somewhere in that wind, perhaps, are the echoes of the nameless women whose lives were claimed by conquest. Their voices may be gone, but their memory endures in the bloodlines they unwillingly shaped. and in the history that bears their pain.